A billionaire forced a maid to marry at gunpoint, but the wedding night changed everything. Before we continue, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us continue the story. The night the gun touched the contract, the thunder outside the Marchmont estate cracked like judgment. The mansion stood on the cliffs of Maine, its windows glowing dimly against the storm. Inside, in a study lined with shelves of leather-bound books, a young maid stood trembling before her employer. Her name was Amara Villanueva, 24, an immigrant who had worked for the Marchmont family for 2 years, quiet, kind, and invisible. Across from her stood Dorian Marchmont, heir to a billion-dollar empire, his dark suit immaculate, his expression colder than the rain hammering the glass. The silver pistol he placed on the oak desk gleamed under the chandelier. "Sign it," he said, his voice even, deadly calm. "You are going to be my wife." Amara's voice cracked. "Mr. Marchmont, I do not understand why me?" Dorian's eyes did not flicker. "Because you are loyal, and because I need someone who does not ask questions." He slid the papers toward her, the marriage certificate already stamped with his signature. "If you refuse, I will make sure your brother's medical debt never gets paid." The words cut sharper than the storm. She stared at him, her lips trembling, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the rain. Her brother Matteo was still in the hospital, fighting for his life. She could not lose him. The study door opened. 2 men in black suits stepped inside, lawyers, witnesses, silent, like statues. One carried a pen. Amara's knees almost gave out. "This is madness," she whispered. Dorian leaned closer, his voice dropping. "This is business." The clock struck 9. Outside, lightning flashed over the sea, illuminating her tear-streaked face. She picked up the pen with shaking hands. For a moment she saw her reflection in the glossy surface of the desk pale, terrified, small. Then she wrote her name. Moments later, she found herself in the mansion's private chapel. Candles flickered. A priest stood waiting, summoned at short notice. Dorian said nothing as the brief vows were exchanged. His hand was firm when he slid the ring onto her finger, but his eyes were unreadable. Amara's heart screamed in silence. When the priest finally whispered, "You may kiss the bride," Dorian only bowed his head and turned away. The echo of the thunder filled the pause that followed. After the ceremony, the guests, if one could call the lawyers and guards guests, left quickly. Amara stood in the marble foyer, staring at the empty staircase. Her veil trembled as a gust of wind pushed through the open door. Somewhere deep inside the house, she heard the faint sound of a piano, notes heavy and dissonant. She turned and saw Dorian at the end of the corridor, staring out the tall window into the storm. Without looking at her, he said, "From this moment on, you do not leave this house. You do not speak of this to anyone. You are Mrs. Marchmont, in name only." Then he walked away. The thunder rolled again as the massive doors of the study closed behind him. Amara stood alone in the silence, clutching the ring on her finger, her breath shallow. Upstairs, a clock chimed 10 times. Her reflection in the marble floor looked like a ghost in a borrowed dress. The mansion felt like a cage of gold and secrets. And somewhere behind one of those locked doors, the man who had forced her into marriage poured himself a drink, staring at the photograph of a woman who was not her. That was the night everything changed, because even in fear, something inside Amara refused to die. She whispered to herself, "You can take my freedom, Mr. Marchmont, but you will never own my soul." Tubai. Stay tuned, because the next part of this story will show how one impossible night would spark a chain of redemption neither of them could have foreseen. The storm had ended by morning, but the air around the Marchmont estate still carried the weight of last night's thunder. Amara woke up in a room far too beautiful to belong to her, a chamber draped in gold and silence. The bed felt untouched. The air smelled faintly of roses and rain. On the vanity lay her wedding ring, heavy as an anchor, gleaming beside a silver brush engraved with the letter M. She stared at her reflection in the mirror and whispered to herself, "You are a wife now to a man who does not believe in love." Her voice barely reached her own ears. Somewhere in the distance, the grandfather clock chimed 7. She rose quietly, folded the nightgown a maid had left for her, and stepped out into the endless hallway that smelled of cedar and money. Downstairs, the house was already alive. The kitchen buzzed with staff, silver trays clattered, and whispers stopped the moment she entered. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Alden, glanced up from the counter with a look that mixed pity and suspicion. "Good morning, Mrs. Marchmont," she said, her tone stiff as porcelain. "Breakfast will be served in the sunroom. Mr. Marchmont is waiting." Amara's stomach tightened. She had not seen Dorian since the chapel. The sunroom overlooked the cliffs, a wall of glass catching the pale morning light. Dorian sat alone at the table, reading a newspaper. A plate of untouched toast and a cup of black coffee sat in front of him. He did not look up when she entered. "Sit," he said flatly. She obeyed, the chair creaking softly. For a moment, only the sound of the sea filled the room. "There are a few rules you should remember," Dorian began, folding the paper with precise movements. "You will remain in this house until I say otherwise. You will not speak to the press or the staff about our marriage, and you will never go into the West Wing." His gaze finally met hers, cold and unreadable. "Do you understand?" Amara nodded slowly. "Yes, Mr. Marchmont." He corrected her immediately. "It is Mrs. Marchmont now." Then, with that same detached tone, he rose and walked away, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and control hanging in the air. When he left for the city, the mansion grew quieter than any church. Amara wandered through the echoing halls, touching the edges of portraits older than her entire life. Each room whispered of a world she did not belong to: crystal chandeliers, marble fireplaces, the ticking of antique clocks that seemed to count her borrowed hours. She found her way into the garden, where the roses were perfectly trimmed, too perfect, almost lifeless. She knelt and touched the soil. It was damp and real. For the first time since the wedding, she breathed. That afternoon, a voice startled her. "You are not supposed to be here," said a young woman carrying a tray of fresh tea. It was Elise, one of the junior maids. Her eyes widened when she recognized the ring on Amara's hand. "Oh, I am sorry, ma'am. I did not mean—" "It is all right," Amara interrupted gently. "I just needed air." Elise hesitated, then whispered, "People talk, Mrs. Marchmont. They say he married you to keep the board from taking the company." Amara's hand stilled on the rosebush. "Maybe they are right," she said softly. "But whatever the reason, I am here now." When dusk came, the housekeeper delivered a sealed envelope to Amara's room. Inside was a key, heavy and old, with a note in Dorian's handwriting. "The door beside the library. Do not enter unless you are ready to see truth." She turned the key in her hand, her pulse quickening. Curiosity battled fear. What truth could he mean? She placed the key in the drawer and blew out the lamp, but sleep never came. The house creaked and shifted like a living thing. At midnight, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Amara froze. The sound passed her door, slow, deliberate. She stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the sea beyond the glass. In the reflection, she caught a glimpse of Dorian standing in the courtyard, shirt sleeves rolled, rain still dripping from his hair, staring up at her window as if searching for something he could not name. She closed the curtain, her heart pounding. For the first time, fear and pity mixed inside her. As the night deepened, she whispered to herself, "You may own this house, Dorian Marchmont, but you cannot silence a heart that still believes in mercy." The wind outside carried her words into the dark, and somewhere beyond the cliffs, the first light of dawn began to rise again. The next morning, Amara woke to the scent of rain still clinging to the curtains. She had barely slept, haunted by the sight of Dorian standing in the courtyard beneath her window. The envelope with the key remained on her nightstand, its message echoing in her head, "Do not enter unless you are ready to see truth." She pressed her fingers to the cool metal and whispered, "Not yet." Outside, the mansion was beginning to stir. Servants' footsteps echoed through the hallways. The faint clatter of dishes drifted from the kitchen. When she entered the breakfast room, Dorian was already there, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, reading through a file. The air between them was heavy with unspoken things. "Good morning," she said softly. He did not look up. "You are awake later than usual," he replied, his tone neutral, eyes still fixed on the papers. "I did not realize I had a schedule," she murmured. That made him glance up, his eyes sharp. "Everyone in this house follows a schedule, Mrs. Marchmont. You will find it easier if you do the same." His words cut like glass, but she forced herself to nod. "Of course." A moment later, the butler entered. "Sir, your mother is on her way from Boston. She wishes to meet your wife." The pause before the word was deliberate. Dorian's jaw tightened. Have the staff prepare the blue salon. Then without another word he rose and left the room. By afternoon, the mansion transformed into a stage. Fresh lilies filled the hallways, silver polished until it shone. Amara stood near the staircase, hands clasped tightly, heart pounding. When the black car arrived, the staff lined up. Out stepped Evelyn Marchmont, tall, elegant, her silver hair pinned perfectly, pearls at her throat. Her gaze swept over Amara like a blade. "So," she said, voice smooth and cold, "this is the woman my son married." Dorian stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Mother, this is Amara." Evelyn smiled thinly. "I have met housekeepers with more confidence. Tell me, dear, do you even know which fork to use at dinner?" The staff exchanged uneasy glances. Amara lowered her eyes but answered calmly, "No, ma'am, but I am willing to learn." Evelyn's smile faltered slightly. Dorian's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. That evening, the dinner felt like walking on broken glass. Evelyn led the conversation, weaving polite insults into every word. "It must be strange," she said, slicing her steak, "to go from cleaning silver to owning it." Dorian finally set down his glass. "Enough," he said quietly. "This discussion is over." Evelyn looked at him, surprised by his tone, then laughed lightly. "My dear boy, I only meant to test her composure." "And she passed," Dorian said, his voice firm. "Better than most people in this room." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. When the guests dispersed, Amara stood on the terrace, watching lightning flash over the distant sea. Dorian joined her, holding 2 glasses of wine. "You handled her well," he said after a pause. "Your mother?" she asked softly. "She is difficult." He handed her a glass. "She does not trust easily. Neither do I." "And yet you trust me enough to make me your wife," she said with quiet irony. Dorian looked away. "Trust has nothing to do with this marriage." His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of regret, quickly buried. They stood in silence, the wind carrying the salt of the ocean through the open doors. Amara sipped her wine, then set the glass down. "Why me, Dorian? Why not someone from your world?" He hesitated. "Because someone from my world would know how to betray me." His words hung in the air like a confession. Later that night, as Amara walked back through the dim corridor, she saw Elise whispering with another maid near the staircase. Their faces turned pale when they saw her. "What is it?" she asked. Elise hesitated, then said quietly, "I heard Mr. Marchmont's lawyer talking. There is a clause in your marriage agreement, something about an inheritance. If you leave before 30 days, everything he owns reverts to his uncle." Amara's breath caught. So that was the reason. Not love, not even protection, just a contract bound by law and greed. She turned toward the west wing, the forbidden side of the house, and thought of the key. Maybe that was where the truth waited. As thunder rumbled again over the cliffs, she whispered, "You may have built this prison, Dorian Marchmont, but I will find the door that sets me free." Then, with trembling hands, she reached for the key that would change everything. That night, the mansion slept under a heavy fog. Amara stood before the door beside the library, the one Dorian had warned her never to enter. The key in her hand felt cold and ancient, its teeth catching the faint moonlight. Every creak of the floor sounded like a warning, but curiosity burned stronger than fear. She slipped the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The door opened to a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of dust and cedar. A single lamp flickered inside, illuminating portraits covered in sheets and stacks of old files, scattered across a massive mahogany desk. As she stepped closer, she saw what the papers were: legal documents, deeds, medical records, and a thin folder marked Eleanor Marchmont. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were photographs of a smiling woman with dark hair and kind eyes, her arm around a much younger Dorian. Her pulse quickened as she read the report beneath it. Deceased in motor collision. Driver, Dorian Marchmont. Her hands shook. The truth struck her like lightning. The woman in the photograph was his fiancée, the one he had lost. The West Wing was not a secret of greed or crime, it was a shrine to guilt. Behind her, a voice cut through the stillness. "You should not be here." Amara turned sharply. Dorian stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes a storm of anger and something deeper pain. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he stepped forward. "I warned you," he said quietly. Why did you come? She clutched the folder to her chest. Because I wanted to understand you. Because no one builds walls this high without something to hide. His expression hardened. You think this is a game? That woman died because of me. I was driving. I survived. His voice cracked. And you, someone who knows nothing of loss, dare to walk through her grave? Amara's throat tightened. You are wrong, she said softly. I know loss. Every day I work to pay for my brother's hospital bed. Every day I wonder if he will live to see another morning. You may have lost her, but you are still alive, Dorian. You still have a chance to make something right. For the first time, his gaze faltered. The fury in his face gave way to exhaustion. Do you really think redemption exists for people like me? He whispered. I do, she answered, her voice steady. But only if you stop punishing the living for the sins of the dead. Silence filled the room. The air between them felt charged, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Then, slowly, Dorian closed the folder and set it back on the desk. You should go, he said, but his tone had changed. It was no longer a command, but a plea. Over the next few days, something in the mansion shifted. Dorian no longer avoided her. He invited her to dinner, sometimes even asked about her brother. He watched her from across the table, studying the way she spoke with warmth even in a house that had none. One morning, he found her arranging flowers in the glass conservatory. You like orchids, she said when he entered. They bloom even in winter. He smiled faintly. That is why I built this room. I wanted something that could survive the cold. She looked at him, realizing he was no longer talking about plants. That night, he joined her in the music room where she often sat alone. She was humming an old lullaby in Spanish, the same song she used to sing to her brother. When he asked what it meant, she told him softly, it means, come home safe. Dorian sat beside her, listening as her voice filled the empty hall. For the first time, the mansion felt less like a prison and more like a place that could breathe again. As the song ended, he said quietly, You make this house feel alive. She smiled gently. Maybe it is not the house. Maybe it is you. He looked at her then, not as a servant, not as a contract, but as the first light breaking through years of darkness. But neither of them noticed the shadow standing at the far end of the hall, Mrs. Evelyn Marchmont, watching silently, her eyes cold and calculating. She had just realized something she had never planned for. Her son was beginning to care for the woman he was supposed to discard. And for the Marchmont family, that kind of weakness was unforgivable. The days that followed moved like quiet tides, slow and heavy, carrying the faint sound of something unspoken between them. Dorian and Amara found themselves crossing paths more often, not by chance, but by quiet design. He began joining her for morning coffee in the conservatory, his tablet forgotten beside the orchids as they spoke about ordinary things, music, weather, and the tiny miracles of daily life. Yet beneath every word, there pulsed a tension neither dared to name. For the first time in years, the walls of the Marchmont estate felt less like fortresses and more like echoes of something fragile trying to bloom. One evening, Dorian returned from the city later than usual. The sky outside was a deep blue, and the rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Amara was in the library, sorting through a pile of old books, when he appeared at the doorway, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable. You are still awake, he said quietly. She smiled faintly. Sleep does not come easy in a house this big. He walked toward her, stopping near the firelight. There was a time when I thought silence was peace. Now it feels like punishment. She looked at him, unsure if he was speaking to her or to the ghosts that haunted him. Maybe peace does not come from silence, she said. Maybe it comes from being heard. Dorian sat down, his gaze fixed on the flames. I spent years building walls around myself. Every loss, every betrayal, it made me stronger, or so I believed. But strength without compassion is just another kind of cruelty. Amara hesitated, then stepped closer. You are not cruel, she said softly. You are afraid of being kind again. The words hit him harder than he expected. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he admitted, I do not remember what kindness feels like. She knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Then, let me remind you. For the first time, he did not pull away. They sat together as the rain grew heavier, the fire painting their faces in gold and amber. Somewhere deep inside, something began to shift. When Amara finally rose to leave, Dorian reached out and stopped her. Stay, he said simply. She froze, not in fear, but in surprise. He added quickly, just for a moment. No contracts, no lies, just stay. She nodded. They said nothing more, yet in that silence, understanding filled the space words could never reach. The next morning the estate buzzed with unusual activity. A charity gala was being prepared, an event planned months before their marriage. Dorian was expected to attend with his wife. When Amara entered the grand ballroom later that night, every head turned. She wore a soft ivory gown borrowed from the estate's collection, her hair swept back, her presence quiet but commanding. Dorian met her at the entrance, his eyes softening for the briefest second before he offered his arm. "Ready to face the wolves?" he asked. "I was raised among them," she replied with a faint smile. The evening unfolded with the elegance of glass and deceit. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, and the sound of champagne glasses echoed through the air. Evelyn Marchmont watched from across the room, her expression polished but her mind racing. At one point, a reporter approached Amara and asked, "Mrs. Marchmont, people say this marriage was unconventional. What do you say to those who think you are here for his money?" The question cut through the music. The crowd quieted. Amara felt Dorian's hand tighten around hers, but she gently pulled away and stepped forward. "If money could buy loyalty, the world would be full of saints," she said calmly. "But it cannot. Love, respect, and compassion, those cannot be purchased. They must be earned." For a heartbeat, the ballroom stood still. Then, to everyone's surprise, several guests began to applaud. Dorian looked at her, pride flickering across his face. Evelyn's smile vanished. Later that night, as they drove back to the estate, rain once again began to fall. Dorian glanced at her, his voice quiet. "You did not just defend me. You defended yourself." She turned toward him, her eyes steady. "I did both, because we are bound by something stronger than a contract now." He smiled almost sadly. "You make me wish this marriage had started differently." The car rolled to a stop outside the mansion. For a moment, neither moved. Then Dorian said softly, "Amara, thank you." She met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. The night that began with thunder months ago now held only the sound of rain, and two hearts finally daring to listen to each other. The morning after the gala carried a strange stillness, the kind that follows a storm before the next one begins. The papers had already printed their headlines, "The Maid Who Stole a Billionaire's Heart." Amara read the words in disbelief as she stood by the kitchen window, the sunlight painting gold lines across the marble floor. Whispers echoed down the corridors. Servants avoided her gaze, half in awe, half in fear of what Evelyn Marchmont might do next. She folded the newspaper and placed it aside just as Dorian entered the room, his phone buzzing in his hand. His jaw was tight, his voice clipped. "The board is furious," he said. "They think last night's speech made me look weak." Amara turned to face him. "You looked human," she said gently. "That is not weakness." Dorian exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "You do not understand how this world works." "Then maybe your world needs to change," she replied. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. For the first time, Dorian had no answer. That afternoon, Evelyn called a meeting in the formal dining room. She sat at the head of the long table, pearls glinting against her black dress, her expression cold. "You have humiliated this family," she said to her son. "You have turned a business arrangement into gossip fodder." Dorian's voice remained calm. "It was not gossip, Mother. It was truth." Evelyn's gaze shifted to Amara. "And do you think one moment of pity can erase where you came from? Women like you do not belong here." Amara straightened, her hand steady. "I did not ask to belong, Mrs. Marchmont. I only asked to be treated with respect." Evelyn laughed softly, a sound like breaking glass. "Respect is earned, and you have done nothing to earn it." Before Dorian could respond, Evelyn rose and swept from the room, her heels clicking like a gavel striking judgment. That night, Dorian found Amara sitting alone in the conservatory. The orchids glowed pale beneath the moonlight. "You should not let her words wound you," he said quietly. Amara looked up at him. "She does not wound me, Dorian. She reminds me." "Of what?" he asked. "That even in the highest house, I must stand for myself." Her voice did not tremble. He watched her for a long moment, then said, "You are stronger than anyone I have ever met." She smiled faintly. "Strength means nothing if it cannot protect the ones I love." Her words lingered as he left for his study. But when he opened the door, he froze. His lawyer, Mr. Holbrook, was already there waiting. The older man's face was tense. "We have a problem," he said. "Your Uncle Harold has discovered the clause in your marriage agreement. He plans to use it to take control of the company. He claims your marriage is invalid because it was coerced." Dorian's expression darkened. "He is bluffing." "He is not," the lawyer said grimly. "He has evidence security footage from the night of the wedding. If it leaks, it will destroy you." The color drained from Dorian's face. He dismissed the lawyer and sat alone in the dim light. The memories came rushing back: the gun, the trembling pen, Amara's tears. Guilt clawed at his chest. He realized that his attempt to control his fate had become the very weapon that could ruin them both. Later that night, unable to sleep, Amara wandered to the west wing. The door to Dorian's study was ajar. She saw him sitting at his desk, head in his hands. "Dorian," she whispered. He looked up, eyes red with exhaustion. "I have done something unforgivable," he said hoarsely. "The truth about our marriage, it is coming out." She stepped closer. "Then we face it together." He shook his head. "You do not understand. It was never supposed to be you. You were never supposed to be hurt." "Oh?" She reached for his hand. "It was supposed to be both of us," she said softly. "Pain shared is not as heavy, and you are not the only one who has ghosts." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he rose and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if afraid she might vanish. Outside, thunder rolled again over the cliffs, a reminder that storms always return. But inside the mansion, for the first time, the two of them stood together, not as prisoner and warden, not as contract and condition, but as two souls beginning to understand that love was not born in perfection, but in the willingness to fight through the wreckage and stay. The following morning, the storm that had brewed outside finally broke within the walls of the Marchmont estate. News spread faster than the wind. The leaked footage of the Gunpoint wedding had hit the internet. Headlines screamed betrayal and scandal. Billionaire forces MAID into marriage Marchmont empire under investigation. Cameras swarmed the mansion gates, reporters shouting questions, flashes of light like lightning every time Dorian's car tried to pass. Inside, chaos unraveled in every corridor. Amara stood frozen in the foyer, clutching the newspaper that carried her photograph, a single frame of her tear-streaked face on the night she had signed the papers. The caption beneath it read, "The wife bought in fear." Her hands trembled as she whispered, "They will never believe the truth now." Dorian entered from the hallway, his tie undone, his face pale and drawn. "You need to pack," he said, voice low but urgent. "They are coming after you too. My uncle has filed charges claiming fraud and coercion. If you stay here, they will tear you apart." She shook her head. "Running will only make it worse." "It is not running," he snapped. "It is survival." "I survived you, Dorian," she said quietly. "I can survive this." His expression broke for the first time. "Amara, please," he whispered. "I did this to you. I need to fix it." By afternoon, the mansion was surrounded by security and flashing lights. Evelyn Marchmont confronted her son in the great hall, fury burning beneath her elegance. "You have destroyed everything your father built," she hissed. "You brought shame to our name for a woman who does not even belong in our world." Dorian faced her squarely. "Then maybe your world is the problem." Evelyn's voice trembled with anger. "You would throw away an empire for this servant?" He looked toward Amara, standing quietly by the staircase. "For the first time I am not throwing something away, Mother. I am saving something worth keeping." Evelyn's eyes blazed. "You are no longer my son." And with that, she walked out, leaving her pearls glinting on the marble floor behind her. When the investigators arrived, Dorian handed them everything: documents, the original contract, even his own confession. "I coerced her," he said, his voice steady. "She had no choice. If anyone should face judgment, it is me." Amara stepped forward, her voice clear. "No, he did not force me to stay. I stayed because I saw the man he could become." The agents exchanged glances, unsure what to believe. That night, when the crowd outside finally dispersed, the mansion felt hollow. Dorian sat alone in his study, staring at the rain sliding down the window pane. Amara entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You should rest," she said. He looked up, his eyes tired but tender. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Keep believing in me." She set the cup down beside him. "Because I have seen what pain can do. It can break people or it can change them. You chose change." "Yukokez." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper, worn from being held too many times. It was a photograph of her and her brother from the hospital, one she had once dropped in the garden. "I kept this," he said. "It reminded me that kindness still exists in the world." Her eyes softened. "Then prove it still does," she whispered. "Fight for the truth, not for your name." The next morning, Dorian called a press conference outside the company headquarters. The media waited, hungry for blood. He stepped to the podium, Amara standing silently beside him. Cameras flashed, rain falling in steady sheets. "What you saw was real," Dorian began. "I made a terrible mistake. I forced someone into something no person should ever face. But that same person showed me what redemption means. She is not the shame of this story. I am. And today, I step down as CEO of Marchmont Holdings." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A reporter shouted, "What about your marriage?" Dorian looked at Amara. "For the first time, it is real." He reached for her hand, and she did not pull away. As they walked back through the storm of cameras and noise, Amara whispered, "You just burned your empire to the ground." Dorian smiled faintly. "Maybe, but sometimes you have to lose everything to find what matters." Behind them, the Marchmont logo shimmered under the rain, no longer a symbol of power, but of reckoning. And for the first time since that gunpoint wedding, the truth began to set them both free. The press conference changed everything. Within hours, Dorian Marchmont's resignation made headlines across the country. The Marchmont empire, once untouchable, began to fracture under the weight of scandal. Board members fled, investors panicked, and the world watched the fall of a dynasty. Yet behind the noise, within the quiet corners of that vast estate, something unexpected began to take shape. Dorian was no longer a billionaire, at least not in the eyes of the world. He had lost everything: his title, his power, his empire, but somehow, for the first time, he seemed at peace. Amara found him early one morning in the conservatory, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in soil as he replanted the orchids that had once been cared for by servants. "You will ruin your suit," she said gently. He glanced up, smiling faintly. "It was never really mine. Neither was this house. Or the company." She knelt beside him, helping him press the roots into the earth. "You still have something that is yours," she said. "Your word." Dorian looked at her, the morning light soft on his face. "I am trying to make that mean something again." Days turned into weeks. The media storm faded, replaced by whispers of sympathy and curiosity. People began to see Dorian not as a villain, but as a man who had faced his own darkness and chosen truth. Amara continued to visit her brother Matteo at the hospital. His health had begun to improve thanks to the fund Dorian had quietly arranged under her name. Each time she returned, she noticed how Dorian was changing. He no longer barked orders or measured success in numbers. Instead, he spent time helping the staff, speaking to the gardeners, repairing things around the estate with his own hands. It was as if humility had built a new kingdom where arrogance once ruled. One afternoon, as autumn light filtered through the glass ceiling, Dorian approached Amara with an envelope. "I want you to have this," he said. Inside was a deed for a small property on the edge of town. "It is for a community center," he explained. "A place where people can find work, shelter, and dignity. I want to name it after your brother." Amara stared at him, her throat tightening. "You do not owe me this," she said. "I do," he replied, "because you taught me that love is not owed, it is chosen." That evening they attended the opening ceremony together. The building was simple but filled with warmth-painted walls, open windows, laughter from children who had already begun to play in the courtyard. A banner read, "The Villanueva Foundation, a promise of hope." When Dorian took the stage to speak, his voice carried the quiet strength of a man reborn. "This is not about redemption," he said. "It is about remembering that power without compassion is meaningless. I lost everything once, and I thought it would destroy me. But it led me here to something real." The applause was gentle, not grand, but it echoed in a way that mattered. Amara stood at the edge of the stage, watching him speak with pride. For the first time, she realized she was not looking at the man who had once terrified her, but at the man she had always believed he could become. When the crowd dispersed, he found her beneath the oak tree outside the center. "You look like someone who has finally found home," he said. She smiled softly. "Maybe home is not a place, Dorian. Maybe it is a person." He took her hand carefully, as if afraid to break the fragile peace between them. "You saved me," he whispered. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You saved yourself. I just reminded you where to start." They stood together as the sun set over the town, the orange glow painting their faces in warmth and promise. That night, back at the estate, the once grand Marchmont mansion no longer felt cold. The halls that had once echoed with orders and silence now carried the quiet rhythm of laughter and soft piano notes. Dorian sat beside Amara as she played, her fingers moving gently over the keys. When the final note faded, he said, "I used to believe love was something to be earned, but you taught me it is something to be lived." She turned to him, her eyes shining. "Then live it, Dorian. Every day." He reached for her hand again, and this time, neither of them let go. Outside, the rain began to fall softly, not as thunder or warning, but as a blessing, washing away the last traces of the night that had once bound them in fear, and sealing the beginning of everything that would finally set them free. A year later, the world had changed in quiet, beautiful ways. The Marchmont estate, once a symbol of power and fear, had become something softer, a sanctuary filled with life. The sound of laughter echoed down its halls, not from parties or polished guests, but from the children who now visited every weekend from the Villanueva Foundation. The orchids in the conservatory bloomed brighter than ever, their petals open like new beginnings. Dorian Marchmont walked through the garden one morning, his hands no longer carrying the weight of titles or expectations, only the calm strength of a man who had finally made peace with his own reflection. Amara stood near the fountain, reading from a sketchbook filled with designs for the new community expansion. She looked up as he approached, smiling. "You are early," she said. "I did not want to miss the sunrise," he replied, handing her a cup of coffee. "Besides, I like watching you work." She laughed softly, setting the book aside. "You used to hate mornings." "I used to hate a lot of things," he said, his tone gentle. "Mostly myself." She reached up to touch his cheek. "Not anymore." He nodded. "Not anymore." They walked together toward the path that overlooked the cliffs. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Dorian stopped, turning to face her fully. His expression was steady, but his voice trembled with emotion. "Amara," he said quietly, "the night I forced you to marry me, I thought I was protecting what was mine. I did not understand that the only thing worth protecting is the heart you choose to honor. You showed me that. You changed me." Her eyes shimmered, and for a moment she could not speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, set with a single diamond. "This time," he said, "no contracts, no lies, no fear. Will you marry me because you want to, not because you must?" Amara covered her mouth with her hands, tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling. Around them, the morning light broke across the horizon, gilding the world in gold. Later that day, they were married again, this time, not in a chapel filled with witnesses or fear, but under the open sky behind the foundation building. The children from the center scattered rose petals along the path. The townspeople stood smiling, some wiping tears. When the officiant asked if he took her as his wife, Dorian said, "I do. And I always will." When it was her turn, Amara said, "I do. Not because I am bound, but because I am free." As they exchanged vows, the rain began to fall lightly, the same way it had on the night of their first wedding, but this time it felt like grace, not punishment. When the ceremony ended, Dorian lifted her into his arms as laughter rose around them. "Do you remember what you told me that first night?" she asked. "I said too many things I regret," he replied with a grin. She smiled. "You told me not to leave this house. And now look at us turning it into a home." He laughed softly. "Then maybe it was the one command I ever gave worth keeping." She leaned into him. "You never commanded me, Dorian. You asked me to believe in you, and I did." He kissed her forehead, whispering, "You believed in me before I did." As the music began and the guests cheered, they danced beneath the gray sky that slowly gave way to sunlight. The Marchmont name, once synonymous with greed, now stood for something else entirely: mercy, truth, and love earned through redemption. And when the last guests departed and the house grew quiet, Amara walked through the halls and paused by the glass case near the grand staircase. Inside were 3 simple objects: a folded contract, a single orchid, and the ring from their first marriage. A plaque beneath them read, "Symbols of Truth." She smiled, tracing her fingers along the glass. Dorian joined her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. Every day, she said softly, but not with pain, with gratitude. They stood together as the sun set beyond the cliffs, the sea below whispering against the rocks. The storm that had once begun their story was gone, replaced by calm skies and the kind of love that no empire could buy and no secret could destroy. And as the final light faded, Dorian whispered, "Home, at last."